The investigation that followed Charlotte's rescue revealed a web of corruption that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. Detective Chief Inspector Helen Morrison, Marcus's superior, took personal charge of the case due to its sensitive nature and potential implications for national security. In the secure interview room at New Scotland Yard, Charlotte sat beside her legal representative, finally, free to tell her story without fear. The recording equipment captured every detail as she described months of psychological manipulation and escalating threats. It started small, Charlotte explained, her voice steady now that she was in a safe environment. Lord Blackwood would make comments about my public appearances, suggesting that certain choices I made could be misinterpreted by the media. Then, he began controlling my schedule more tightly, claiming it was for my own protection. Marcus, who had been commended for his actions, but was also being questioned about his decision-making process, listened from the observation room. His years of training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for the complex emotions involved in protecting someone from their own supposed protectors. The investigation team had discovered that Jonathan Pierce represented a shell company with ties to several international criminal organizations. The documents Charlotte had been pressured to sign would have transferred ownership of several royal properties to offshore accounts, effectively stealing millions of pounds worth of assets from the crown. Dr. Chun had provided crucial testimony about Charlotte's deteriorating mental state over the past months. She went from being one of the most confident people I knew to someone who jumped at shadows, she told investigators. I started documenting my concerns because I was considering asking for a wellness check, but I didn't know who to trust within the royal system. The photographs and financial records that Pierce's group had threatened to release were examined by forensics experts and found to be sophisticated forgeries. The real tragedy was how effectively these fabricated threats had controlled Charlotte's behavior and isolated her from potential help. Lord Blackwood's interrogation revealed that he had been recruited years earlier by Pierce's organization, which specialized in high-level extortion schemes targeting wealthy and influential families across Europe. Charlotte wasn't their first victim, but her position as a senior member of the British royal family made her their most valuable target. The beauty of it, Blackwood had said during his confession, apparently proud of his strategic thinking, was that she couldn't go to anyone without risking the very scandal we threatened her with. Royal family members are trained from birth to avoid any hint of impropriety. That training became her prison. Meanwhile, Charlotte was working with counselors to process the trauma of her experience. The isolation and constant fear had taken a toll that would require time and support to overcome. But she was also determined to use her experience to help others who might be facing similar situations. 3 weeks after the garden party incident, Charlotte made her first public appearance since the arrests. She had chosen to visit a domestic violence shelter, speaking privately with women who understood what it meant to be trapped by threats and manipulation. Marcus, now assigned as her primary protection officer at Charlotte's personal request, watched as she interacted with the shelter residents. Her empathy was genuine and hard-earned, coming from someone who truly understood the powerlessness these women had experienced. The hardest part, Charlotte told one young mother, was feeling like I couldn't trust anyone. When the people who are supposed to protect you become the source of threat, you start to doubt your own judgment about everything. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. But you got out. You found someone who listened. Charlotte glanced toward Marcus, who maintained his professional distance while staying alert to the surroundings. I got lucky. I found someone who was willing to act on a desperate note hidden behind a window. But no one should have to depend on luck for their safety. The ripple effects of the case continued to unfold. Parliament launched an investigation into security procedures for royal family members, questioning how such an extensive manipulation scheme had gone undetected for so long. Several reforms were implemented, including mandatory rotation of private staff and independent oversight of royal household finances. Pierce's organization was found to have been operating across multiple countries, targeting influential families through similar psychological manipulation techniques. Interpol coordinated with various national police forces to dismantle the network, leading to arrests in France, Germany, and Switzerland. Victoria Ashworth, who had been Blackwood's primary accomplice, received a lighter sentence in exchange for providing detailed information about the organization's methods. During her testimony, she described how they had studied Charlotte's personality and family dynamics to craft the most effective psychological pressure points. "We knew she would sacrifice herself to protect her family's reputation," Ashworth explained to investigators. That loyalty was supposed to be her weakness, but it turned out to be what gave her the strength to resist us in the end. Dr. Sarah Chun had been instrumental in helping Charlotte recover, but she also played a crucial role in developing new protocols for recognizing signs of psychological abuse among high-profile individuals. Her research, conducted with Charlotte's full support and participation, was shared with protection services worldwide. 6 months after the incident, Marcus received a commendation for his actions, but the recognition that meant the most to him was Charlotte's personal letter of gratitude. In it, she wrote, "You saw something that everyone else missed, not just the note I left, but the person behind the title who needed help. You proved that sometimes the most important part of protection isn't stopping bullets, but recognizing when someone is drowning in plain sight." Charlotte's public role evolved following her ordeal. She became an advocate for victims of psychological abuse and manipulation, using her platform to raise awareness about these often invisible forms of violence. Her speeches carried the weight of personal experience, making her message particularly powerful. The annual memorial service for domestic violence victims became one of Charlotte's most important engagements. Standing at the podium in Westminster Abbey, she spoke to an audience that included survivors, advocates, and government officials. "Abuse thrives in silence and isolation," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It depends on victims believing that they are alone, that no one will understand, that speaking out will only make things worse. But the truth is that somewhere, someone is always willing to listen, to act, to help. Sometimes we just have to be creative about how we ask for that help." Marcus stood at his assigned position, but his attention was focused entirely on Charlotte's words. He thought about the desperate note pressed against hospital glass, about the courage it had taken for someone in her position to reach out to anyone, even in such an uncertain way. The investigation had also revealed how close Charlotte had come to disappearing entirely. Pierce's group had been preparing to relocate her to a private facility overseas, claiming she was suffering from exhaustion and needed treatment away from public scrutiny. Once there, she would have been completely isolated and under their control. The timeline was accelerating because the princess was starting to resist more openly. Chief Inspector Morrison had explained to Marcus during the debriefing, "Your intervention literally saved her life, not just her freedom." As Charlotte concluded her speech at Westminster Abbey, she did something unexpected. She looked directly at Marcus and gave an almost imperceptible nod, a private acknowledgement between two people who had shared an extraordinary moment of crisis and trust. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words, but for the journey she had taken from victim to survivor to advocate. The note behind the hospital glass had been a desperate plea from someone who felt powerless. The woman standing at the podium was someone who had reclaimed not just her freedom, but her voice. Later that evening, as Marcus completed his shift, he reflected on how a simple moment of awareness had changed everything. His training had taught him to watch for threats from the outside, but Charlotte's case had shown him that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from within, disguised as protection and care. The real victory wasn't just in stopping the criminals or recovering the money they had tried to steal. It was in the fact that Charlotte had found a way to signal for help when every official channel had been compromised or blocked. Her silent plea behind the glass had been answered by someone willing to look beyond protocol and see a human being in desperate need. Dr. Chen often reflected on the case in her research into institutional abuse. "The most sophisticated predators don't just target individuals," she wrote in her published study. "They target the systems designed to protect those individuals, corrupting them from within." Charlotte's case shows us that we need to always leave room for unexpected channels of communication, for the possibility that help might be needed from the most unexpected places. Marcus continued his career in royal protection, but with a heightened awareness of the subtle signs of distress that might indicate threats from within. He became an instructor, teaching other officers to recognize when their protective instincts needed to extend beyond physical security to emotional and psychological safety. The criminal organization's network was eventually dismantled completely, but the case remained a watershed moment in how protective services approached their responsibilities. Charlotte's courage in placing that note behind the hospital glass hadn't just saved herself. It had exposed a threat that could have targeted countless others. Years later, when Charlotte married and started a family of her own, she maintained her advocacy work while embracing a more private life. The trauma of her experience had become a source of strength, informing her understanding of how institutions could both protect and harm the people they served. Marcus remained part of her security detail by choice, honored to continue protecting someone who had taught him that sometimes the most important thing a protector could do was simply notice when someone needed help and be brave enough to act on that observation. The hospital where Charlotte had left her desperate message installed a small plaque in the corridor where the incident occurred. It read, "Sometimes the smallest gestures require the greatest courage." Most visitors passed by without understanding its significance. But for those who knew the story, it served as a reminder that help can come from the most unexpected places, and that paying attention to silent pleas can change everything. The garden party was in full swing when Marcus noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. Lord Blackwood had positioned himself near the entrance to the secluded area where Charlotte was supposed to give her speech, effectively controlling who could approach her. Victoria Ashworth stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed excessive for a simple charity event. Charlotte moved through the gathered guests like a ghost of herself. Marcus watched as she accepted congratulations for her recent charitable work, smiled for photographs, and engaged in polite conversation, all while her eyes occasionally darted toward the exits. Her performance was flawless to everyone else, but Marcus could see the fear building beneath her composed exterior. Dr. Sarah Chun, Charlotte's longtime friend and a pediatric surgeon at the hospital they had visited yesterday, approached the princess near the rose garden. Marcus positioned himself within earshot, curious about this interaction since Dr. Chun wasn't on the official guest list. "Charlotte, I've been worried about you," Dr. Chun said quietly, her voice filled with genuine concern. "You seemed so distressed yesterday, and when you didn't return my calls." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced nervously toward Lord Blackwood's position. "Sarah, everything's fine. Just tired from the busy schedule." But Dr. Chun wasn't convinced. She had known Charlotte since their university days, before royal protocol became a barrier between them. "This isn't like you. You've been avoiding our lunch dates, and when we do speak, you seem—" "Your Royal Highness." Victoria Ashworth appeared beside them with practiced timing. "It's time to prepare for your speech." The interruption was smooth and professional, but Marcus caught the flash of panic in Charlotte's eyes. Dr. Chun looked confused by the abrupt dismissal, but years of royal protocol training had taught most people not to question such interventions. As Victoria guided Charlotte toward the secluded area, Marcus made a crucial decision. He activated the small recording device he carried for security purposes and began to follow at a distance. The path to the gazebo wound through increasingly dense garden areas, moving away from the main party and the other security personnel. Marcus's radio crackled with routine check-ins from other team members, but he noticed that the frequency was oddly scheduled to leave gaps, periods when communication would be limited. This wasn't coincidental. Someone had planned these communication blackouts. In the secluded garden area, Lord Blackwood was waiting with two men Marcus didn't recognize. They weren't part of the regular security detail, and their positioning suggested they were there for purposes other than protection. Charlotte's steps slowed as she approached, her instincts clearly warning her of danger. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Blackwood said smoothly. "These gentlemen have some important matters to discuss with you regarding your future responsibilities." One of the men, tall with graying temples and an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Princess Charlotte, I'm Jonathan Pierce from Meridian Holdings. We've been working with Lord Blackwood on some arrangements that require your cooperation." Marcus moved closer, using the garden's landscaping to remain hidden while positioning himself to intervene if necessary. He could see Charlotte's hands trembling as she clutched her small purse, and Her voice was barely steady as she replied, "I don't understand. What arrangements? My father never mentioned any meetings with private companies." Pierce exchanged a look with Lord Blackwood before continuing. "These are delicate matters, Your Royal Highness. Matters that concern your family's financial obligations and certain indiscretions that have come to light." Charlotte's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" Lord Blackwood stepped closer, his voice taking on a menacing tone that Marcus had never heard him use in public settings. "Princess, you've been living in a fantasy if you think your family's reputation is spotless. Your brother's gambling debts, your father's questionable business associations, these things have consequences." Marcus realized he was witnessing the culmination of what was clearly a long-term manipulation campaign. These people had been gathering leverage against the royal family, and Charlotte was their target for whatever scheme they had planned. "We need you to sign some documents," Pierce said, producing a leather portfolio. "Transfer agreements for certain properties, authorization for financial arrangements. Simple formalities, really. And if I refuse?" Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. The second stranger, a shorter man with cold eyes, spoke for the first time. "Refusal isn't really an option, Your Royal Highness. Not unless you want certain photographs and financial records to become public knowledge. The press would have a field day." Marcus felt his blood boil as he watched these men threaten Charlotte. The extortion was brazen, taking place in broad daylight on royal grounds. But he realized that the location was carefully chosen, secluded enough for coercion, but official enough to make any signed documents appear legitimate. Charlotte's hands shook as she took the documents. "I need time to read these, to consult with." "You'll sign them now," Lord Blackwood interrupted, his mask of politeness completely dropped. "Or those photographs go public tonight, along with a very detailed account of your family's financial improprieties." Marcus saw Charlotte's shoulders sag in defeat. Whatever evidence they held over her was devastating enough to make her consider compliance. But as she lifted the pen Pierce offered her, something in her posture changed. Instead of resignation, Marcus saw determination. Charlotte suddenly looked up from the documents, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "You know what? I've spent my entire life being afraid of scandal, of disappointing people, of not being perfect enough for this role. But I won't let you destroy innocent people with your lies." She dropped the pen and stepped backward. "Whatever you think you have on my family, we'll deal with it honestly. I won't be part of your criminal scheme." The change in the men's demeanor was immediate and threatening. Pierce stepped forward aggressively, and the cold-eyed man moved to block Charlotte's retreat path. Lord Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "You spoiled little princess," he snarled. "You think your title protects you from everything? You'll sign those documents, or what?" Marcus stepped out from behind the hedge, his hand resting on his radio, and his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Are you threatening a member of the royal family?" The group froze. Pierce and his associate immediately stepped back, but Lord Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Detective Inspector, you're out of bounds. This is a private conversation." Marcus moved closer to Charlotte, who looked both relieved and terrified by his appearance. "Any conversation involving threats against Princess Charlotte is very much my business. Your Royal Highness, are these men threatening you?" Charlotte looked between Marcus and her tormentors, clearly torn between speaking the truth and fear of the consequences. But Marcus's steady presence seemed to give her courage. "Yes," she said firmly. "They've been blackmailing me for months. They want me to sign documents that I believe are fraudulent, and they're threatening to release fabricated evidence against my family if I don't comply." Pierce tried to salvage the situation. "Detective Inspector, there's been a misunderstanding. These are legitimate business arrangements." "Then you won't mind explaining them to my colleagues," Marcus said, activating his radio. "I'm requesting immediate backup to the East Garden gazebo for suspected extortion and threats against a protected person." Lord Blackwood's composure cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Thompson. This goes far beyond what you understand." Marcus kept his position between Charlotte and the three men while backup arrived. Within minutes, the secluded garden area was surrounded by additional security personnel. Pierce and his associate were immediately detained, while Lord Blackwood found himself facing questions he couldn't answer satisfactorily. As the immediate threat was neutralized, Marcus turned to Charlotte, who was visibly shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Your Royal Highness, you're safe now. But we need to understand the full scope of what's been happening." Charlotte nodded, tears beginning to flow for the first time since the ordeal began. "Detective Inspector, how did you know? How did you know to be here?" Marcus pulled the small note from his jacket pocket. "You left me a message yesterday, behind the glass at the hospital. It was a brave thing to do, reaching out when you had nowhere else to turn." Charlotte's eyes widened as she recognized her own handwriting. "You found it? I wasn't even sure if you'd seen me place it there. I was so desperate. And you were the only person I could think of who might help without being part of their scheme." As they walked back toward the main party, Marcus realized that Charlotte's ordeal was likely far from over. The investigation into Lord Blackwood's activities would probably reveal a much larger conspiracy, and the princess would need protection not just from physical threats, but from the psychological trauma of months of manipulation. Dr. Chen appeared as they reached the edge of the party area, having somehow sensed that something significant had happened. Charlotte broke down in her friend's arms, finally, able to release the fear and stress she had been carrying for so long. Marcus watched the reunion while coordinating with his colleagues about the ongoing investigation. He knew that his decision to act on Charlotte's desperate plea had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone involved in the conspiracy. The real work of unraveling the full extent of the threat was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Kensington Palace as Charlotte Windsor stepped out of the black sedan. Her pearl earrings caught the light, but her eyes remained fixed on the ground. The 24-year-old princess had learned to keep her emotions carefully hidden behind a practiced smile, especially on days like today when the cameras were everywhere. Detective Inspector Marcus Thompson stood at his assigned position near the palace entrance, his trained eyes scanning the crowd of photographers and onlookers. He had been part of the Royal Protection Unit for 8 years, long enough to read the subtle signs that others missed. Today, something felt different about Princess Charlotte's demeanor. The princess walked with her usual grace, her navy blue dress perfectly pressed, her blonde hair styled in an elegant updo. To the outside world, she looked every inch the composed royal attending another charity event. But Marcus noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her clutch purse, and how her smile never quite reached her eyes. Charlotte paused at the entrance of the children's hospital, turning to wave at the gathered crowd. The photographers shouted her name, their cameras clicking rapidly. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, but Marcus caught something else, a quick, almost desperate glance toward the palace windows behind them. Someone was watching from the 4th floor, a tall figure in a dark suit partially hidden behind the curtains. Lord Edmund Blackwood, Charlotte's private secretary, and the man her father had appointed to manage her public appearances, had been increasingly controlling over the past 6 months. What had started as guidance had slowly transformed into something more sinister. Charlotte's schedule had become suffocating, her personal time monitored, her phone calls screened. As they entered the hospital, Charlotte's heels clicked against the polished floor. The head nurse, Mrs. Jennifer Collins, greeted them warmly, leading them through the pediatric ward. Charlotte knelt beside hospital beds, speaking softly to young patients, her genuine compassion shining through despite her inner turmoil. These moments with the children were among the few times she felt truly herself. Marcus maintained his position a few steps behind, but his attention was divided between potential security threats and Charlotte's increasingly anxious behavior. When she thought no one was looking, he noticed her checking her phone repeatedly, her face growing paler with each glance at the screen. During a brief pause in the schedule, Charlotte excused herself to use the restroom. Marcus positioned himself outside, following standard protocol. Through the slightly open door, he heard what sounded like a muffled phone call. Charlotte's voice was barely audible, but he caught fragments. "Please, I can't tomorrow night. Help me." When she emerged, her makeup had been carefully reapplied, but Marcus could see the telltale redness around her eyes that suggested she had been crying. She avoided his gaze, something she had never done before in all their previous interactions. The hospital visit continued for another 2 hours. Charlotte read stories to children in the cancer ward, participated in a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new treatment facility, and posed for official photographs with hospital administrators. Throughout it all, Marcus observed her growing distress. Her usual warmth seemed forced, and she kept glancing toward the exits as if planning an escape route. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte stopped suddenly in the hospital corridor. She turned toward a large window that overlooked the courtyard below, where their security vehicles waited. For a moment, she pressed her palm against the glass, staring out with an expression Marcus had never seen before, pure desperation. Lord Blackwood's assistant, a stern woman named Victoria Ashworth, appeared at Charlotte's elbow. "Your Royal Highness, we must maintain the schedule," she said firmly, her voice carrying an undertone that sounded more like a warning than a reminder. Charlotte nodded mechanically, but, as she turned away from the window, she did something unexpected. She pressed a folded piece of paper against the glass for just a moment before slipping it into the small gap between the window frame and the wall. The movement was so quick and subtle that only someone watching her closely would have noticed. Marcus filed this detail away in his mind as they exited the hospital. The ride back to the palace was silent except for Victoria's voice as she reviewed Charlotte's upcoming engagements. Charlotte stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Back at the palace, as the official vehicles pulled away, Marcus found himself unable to shake his growing concern. He had been trained to protect the royal family from external threats. But what happened when the danger came from within their own circle? That evening, Marcus completed his shift and was preparing to leave when he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading straight home, he drove back to the hospital. Using his security credentials, he gained access to the building and made his way to the corridor where Charlotte had stopped earlier. The window was exactly as he remembered it. Marcus carefully examined the area where he had seen Charlotte place the paper. There, wedged almost invisibly between the frame and wall, was a small, folded note. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it. Written in Charlotte's distinctive handwriting were just 4 words: "Help me. He's dangerous." Below that, in smaller text, "Tomorrow. Garden party. Please." Marcus stood in the empty hospital corridor, the weight of discovery settling over him. Princess Charlotte, one of the most protected people in the world, was reaching out for help in the most desperate way imaginable. She was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape through normal channels. And, somehow, she had identified him as someone she could trust. The implications were staggering. If Charlotte was in genuine danger from someone within the royal household, it meant that the very people trusted to protect her might be complicit in her suffering. It also meant that Marcus was now faced with an impossible choice: follow protocol and report this through official channels, where it might be buried or dismissed, or take matters into his own hands to help someone who clearly had nowhere else to turn. As he drove home through the London streets, Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities. Who was the he Charlotte referred to? Lord Blackwood seemed the obvious suspect, given his increasing control over her life. But it could be someone else entirely. And what was planned for the garden party that had Charlotte so frightened? Marcus arrived at his modest flat in South London, but sleep was impossible. He sat at his kitchen table, Charlotte's notes spread before him, analyzing every word. The princess's elegant handwriting, usually so confident in the documents he had seen her sign, appeared shaky and hurried. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding. This was a genuine cry for help from someone who had exhausted all other options. The next morning, Marcus reported for duty with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The palace was already bustling with preparations for the afternoon garden party, an annual event that would host over 200 guests from various charitable organizations. Charlotte would be the guest of honor, expected to mingle, give a speech, and represent the crown with her usual poise. Marcus positioned himself strategically throughout the morning, observing the interactions between Charlotte and her handlers. Lord Blackwood seemed particularly agitated, making frequent phone calls and speaking in hushed tones with Victoria Ashworth. Charlotte herself appeared withdrawn, going through the motions of her morning routine, but lacking her usual energy. During the pre-event briefing, Marcus learned that Charlotte's schedule had been modified at the last minute. She would be giving her speech from a secluded area of the garden, away from the main crowd, ostensibly for better acoustics and more intimate interaction with key donors. But Something about this change troubled Marcus deeply. As the guests began arriving for the garden party, Marcus felt the tension building. Charlotte appeared on the palace steps wearing a flowing yellow dress that should have made her look radiant, but instead seemed to emphasize her pallor. She moved through the early part of the event like someone sleepwalking, her responses to guests polite, but distant. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor while keeping Charlotte in sight at all times. He noticed that Lord Blackwood and his associates were gradually steering her toward the more isolated section of the garden where her speech was scheduled to take place. The area was beautiful, surrounded by high hedges and featuring a small gazebo, but it was also largely hidden from the view of other guests and security personnel. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus realized that Charlotte's tomorrow had arrived, and whatever she feared was about to happen. The question was whether he would be able to act quickly enough to prevent it, and whether he was prepared to risk everything, his career, his reputation, possibly even his life, to save someone whose silent plea behind the hospital glass had revealed a truth that no one else was willing to see.